Okay. So this is the registry protocols extensions working group, and I am Jim Galvin. One of the co-chairs, Antoine Rashurin, is the other co-chair, and he is available. He is online in Jabber and on the Meet Echo. I have the note whale up in the room. And just give me a minute here to see. So presentations, one thing I don't understand about the Meet Echo, so will they just, do I have to do anything for them to appear in the Meet Echo room? How do they get there? Oh, there we go. No, so that is the set of people who are in the queue. Not clear to me how people see the slides, I guess. Is that just part of when they're displaying the people standing in the pink box? My problem is I cannot see Jabber while I am sitting here doing this, while I have the display up. Okay. So I apologize for a little bit of just getting this stuff organized and shown. So let's start. First thing, of course, is the note well. I've just put this up here. I'm sure that everyone has seen it. So I'm going to shift right into moving the agenda. Hopefully no one has any questions about any of that. First thing is our Jabber scribe, Marco. Yes, okay, so you'll be our Jabber scribe, okay, and Ulrich had volunteered to be the note scribe. All right, so we have that taken care of, and we've done the note well. We have one other important piece of business before we dive into our work here, and that is we have our outgoing area director, Barry, and seems there is a tradition among area. We'll move up here to the mic, and I guess we'll try to both get into this little pink square here. But certainly on behalf of this working group and Antoine and myself, just want to present you with this appropriate ceremonial comment here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
You have to share it with all of us.
Get a glass.
So comment from the floor, you have to share it from all of us, and Barry says get a glass. I understand you're collecting quite a few of these, so enjoy your travels home. I think is the best comment there. Okay, so moving on in the agenda to document status. Let me just switch this to a slideshow view so that we can look at this. We have in particular two documents that are in the publication queue, in the publication cycle with the ISG. The first one, of course, is the EPP extensions relay, okay? And the first one is up here, and let me ask Scott, do you want to take a moment to speak to the issue of the IPR claims, our status?
Sure, Scott Hollenbeck. I am the person in whose view there was a potential IPR issue here. VeriSign does have a patent that describes this. I am unfortunately still waiting for guidance from, the appropriate powers that be at VeriSign as to what the update will be. So unfortunately, I cannot say that a decision has been made, but I do hope that we will have something we can do within the next few weeks.
And I think for right now, from the point of view of the working group, I mean, the right thing is just to leave the document as is. I mean, unless anyone wants to suggest something else, we'll leave that alone. Is Peter Koch in the room at all? No? Okay. The other comment that I will make about that document, and is this something like an autoplay or something here? Is that the problem with these slides? I'll go look for that in a minute. There was a comment from Stephen Farrell to ask if we wanted to revive a document that Peter had brought to the DNSOP working group. He has a name server change document that was visible there. And as part of reviewing this document in the ISG, Stephen Farrell had made this comment. It's not clear yet at the moment what to do about that comment and whether Stephen was satisfied with the fact that we just wanted to let that go. So I just mentioned for completeness here in the group that for people to be aware that we do have that one ISG comment from Stephen Farrell in addition to the IPR claim to follow up on. And it's really partly about asking Peter Koch what he would like to do. And does he want to revive it and force it to be something that has to be reviewed in the context of this document? Or is he comfortable just letting that go and focusing instead on this key relay document? So, okay, the next document is the TMCH SMD document. And I have the comment to make there is it has been approved by the ISG to be published, and that is not actually reflected in this particular slide because I have the wrong version of the agenda here in front of me, but that's okay. On March 14th, the ISG approved that, and it is now in the RFC editor's queue, and so that's a success from our point of view as far as what the status of that document is. It's just working the process. It's one step before auth 48. So the RFC editor is just doing their part, and then it'll go to auth 48, and we'll be able to move that document along. So that's a good thing. Okay. So next we have two documents that have been left over from our EPP extensions working group. And so let's look at the two of those and their status. The first one, of course, is the launch phase document. And I will give the update that that document, it was left on the mailing list with a minor editorial change. Looks like the authors all agreed to make this change. We have not actually created a new document with that change in it. But the more important issue with the launch phase document is that it's dependent on the TMCH functional spec document. Okay, so let's move to the functional spec document here and have a presentation by that. We have Gavin, who's going to present on this document remotely. And somebody needs to mute. They perhaps have a child in the background. I don't know. That is kind of interesting. All right, so I have Gavin's slides here, and Gavin should be logged in as a presenter, I believe. And Gavin, you should be able to. Or Gustavo. Okay, all right. Francisco is going to step up here and take care of these slides. That's fine too.
It's actually just one slide.
Yeah, it's just the one slide. So, and there we go.
Yeah. So Gustavo made some changes based on the feedback he received on the other draft, the SMD draft. Some of the changes that he had made in the other draft were affecting this one. So he made those changes and also changed the internet status from informational to standards track, and a few other minor changes. And he believes that this document is ready for last call. That's it.
Okay, thank you. So The previous document, we believe, is ready for last call, and so now the question is whether this document is, and we also believe, the working chairs, that this document is ready for last call, unless somebody wants to speak up and has some particular comments to make. Since the launch phase is dependent on this document, the suggestion here, the action would be to submit them both together to the ISG for review. The first next step will be to bring to the mailing list whether or not these a last call to the mailing list for these documents. So let me ask first in this room here if anyone objects or has any reason to believe that these documents are not ready for last call. And I'm not seeing any hands in the room here. Oh, no, okay. I saw some computers being set aside. Laptops made me nervous. He's going to run to the mic. So, okay. So with that, the action on these two documents then is simply to assert on the mailing list that there's a last call and provide a week to make sure that we don't miss anybody for anybody who's not in the room. And the other thing that we will need for these two documents is a document shepherd in order to prepare to submit them to the ISG when the last call is done. So let me first ask if there's anyone who wants to volunteer for that. Anyone want to step up and volunteer? And I have a hand in the room from Ulrich. Ulrich Wisser says he'll volunteer. Anyone else want to do this? We're just going to let Ulrich be the guy in front, all right? Okay, well, thank you very much again, second time, being our note scribe and also agreeing to be document shepherd. So that'll be good. These will be the last two documents that are left over from our EPPX charter. Okay. So the next thing here is a look at so here we have a list of all of the documents which are in our charter, the Regext charter, that we had carried forward and previously agreed were going to be work items for this working group. They all have milestones, so they have dates set to their milestones, but I didn't include all of that here on the agenda here, but you can certainly go back and look at the charter. They're still ordered in the way in which they were ordered in the charter. Right, so if the order looks sort of odd because they're not alphabetical or anything, that's why. They're just listed in that order. So what we're going to do here next is take some time to jump in and look at two of those documents, registry fee extension and the reseller extension. And I apologize. So this is the one which is Gavin, who is going to present remotely about the registry fee extension. These are, two of the documents in our list here of 11 documents that were in our charter for registry extensions. So Gavin, are you there and able to speak while I bring up your slides?
Yes, I am here and I am able to speak.
All right, very good. We can hear you.
Great. And you may also be able to see
Let
me
me
now.
just get your slides here. Give me a moment. There we go.
Great.
And I presume, can you see your own slides too?
Yes, I can. Yeah. I don't know if I can.
Okay,
drop
and I will advance slides for you. Just ask for the next slide.
Yep. Okay.
Actually, it's
so
advancing without us.
oh, I'm done.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it does that. There must be. Oh, thank you. Okay. Gavin, over to you.
Okay. So the last time I spoke about this, I think there's been 2 revisions of the draft since the last time I presented to the EPPX group about it. I feel like that we're kind of getting close to the kind of the end phase for this draft, and obviously at some point it will be adopted by the working group. Most recent significant changes were in the 05 revision. Removed the info form for requiring fee information. There was a pretty strong consensus that check was preferred over info, and I didn't like the idea of having 2 different ways of doing the same thing, so I decided to standardize on check. and then the most recent revision changed the extension so that it didn't assume that the objects that it was being applied to were RFC 5731 domains. So you could use it for with other domain name object types, or even apply it to things like name server or contact objects as well, if that was your particular preference. So also the most recent change to the draft was just to tidy it up, ready for the kind of final phase, adding implementation status section, and anyone who has an implementation, I would like to know about it so I can put it into the draft, ready for publication as RFC. I'd like to move on to the next slide. The issue that I'm here to talk about is an undecided choice that we haven't made yet, which is how we may choose to optimize the check syntax. There are three options that Jim outlined in his email, Jim Gould, that is outlined in his email to the list when this was most recently discussed. The way that the extension currently works is that the check command has a format, a syntax which is completely uncoupled from the main availability check. And if you look at the next slide, there's an example of what the check command looks like. You can see that it's entirely possible for a client to specify one domain name in the main body of the check command, and then a completely different completely different object in the extension element, which is confusing. So what we're looking at doing maybe is changing that to make it a little bit more sensible. If you move on to the next slide and see what the response looks like, which is basically where what the client sends is echoed back. So the response returns a different domain name in the availability section to the domain name referenced in the pre-check extension element. So the next option would be, if you'd like to move on, is to synchronize the domain names or objects that are referenced in the main body of the command to those that are in the extension element. And there are two different approaches to that. The first one would be to specify in the extension section just a set of fee parameters that are then applied to the objects that are listed in the main body of the check. So you can see here we're listing two different domain names in the check section, and then in the extension section we're saying we want to know what the create fee is in US dollars for these two objects. And then the next slide shows the response. Then what happens is that the server will take the parameters that were given in the extension element, apply them to each of the objects listed in the main body of the check, and you get a CD element corresponding to each object with the information echoed back to you. The third option is a little bit more complex, and the way that the third option works is that the extension section allows you to specify multiple different commands, each with its own set of parameters, and then each one of those parameters, each set of parameters are then applied to each object in the main body of the check command. So if you look at the next slide, which shows you an example of how that would work, the main body of the check command has two name objects listed in it, and then there are two different command elements in the extension. And so for two objects in the main body of the check and two commands in the extension, you get multiplies that out, and you get four different elements in the response, which is a bit too big to fit on a PowerPoint slide, so I didn't bother putting it in. But if you go to the mailing list archive, you'll see what that looks like. So the decision really is which of those solutions is preferable for the audience that are going to be consuming this extension. And so I'm listening really for some sort of consensus. I'm not sure I'm talking about big C consensus, but some indication of where the community would like this to move, A, B, or C.
Okay. So let me ask first in the room here for any comments or questions. No one's kind of running to the mic. I see that we have some queue here in Meet Echo. So I know that Jim Gould is in the queue, and I actually can't see the queue at this point. All I see is Gavin Brown. But Jim, so go ahead if you want to speak. Can you speak?
Can you hear me?
There we go. Go ahead.
Fantastic. Yeah, I actually wanted to point out one additional item on the options is in the response, one of the issues with the existing draft is the fact that if the fee cannot be provided for the domain name, there's no way to indicate that it's unavailable to provide the fee. Like, for example, if an invalid command or a period or invalid domain name is provided, that there's no ability to do that. So in the options that were on the list, there's ability in the response to include an avail flag to indicate that the fee cannot be provided, and with an optional reason.
Yeah.
But of the options, I think on the
actually
list,
the example I gave did have that, but I didn't mention it.
oh, okay, good.
I'm sorry, say again, Gavin?
Sorry, yeah. I think if you go back to the response for option B, I may have actually included that syntax, but I didn't explicitly mention it.
I'm sorry. So we're having trouble with the audio. I think James and Gavin were both talking over each other. Gavin, if you want to first respond to James, and then we'll go back to James to finish your comments.
Okay, yeah. So James is right. There is that issue. I think in the slide I did copy the avail attributes onto the response for option B. I don't remember, but I think yeah, they were added, and the idea is that, yeah, that's exactly as Jim says, that if the attributes are of the command are somehow wrong, you don't really want to reject everything. You don't want to reject the entire command. You just want to say that you can't create this domain in GBP or something like that. The particular policy isn't applicable to that object. So rather than rejecting the whole thing with a simple EPP error, you want to signal that that particular combination of object and command isn't permitted. So the attribute on the CD element is used to signal that.
Okay, thank you, Gavin. And James, did you have anything else you wanted to add? And I'm guessing not, you're not in the queue. Okay, go ahead, Scott.
Scott Hollenbeck. Actually, this was a question to Jim. I know you were specifically asked if you had an opinion on which option, Jim, and I know that you and I had talked about this ahead of time. I apologize, I don't remember exactly which of the options you expressed a preference for. I know which one I have a preference for, but Jim, if you're still listening, could you tell us which of the options was the one that you thought was the best? I feel like that Jeopardy jingle should be playing here while we wait. You know, do 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 do.
So I pushed the magic red button to unmute, but I'm wondering do I have to push it again here each time now that I've done it once? It's an interesting question. Well, let's try.
No one's talking in Jabber or anything either?
Yeah, I can't see the Jabber. Marco, is there anyone in the Jabber?
James Gold, opting for option C. Alexander Meyer, however,
Can you speak into a microphone? I'm sorry.
Sure. Channel the Jabberers.
Marco Azadin, JavaScript. James Gold is opting for option C, and Alexander Meyer, however, also from the Jabber room, has a preference for option B. A personal preference.
Okay, and Scott Hollenbeck again. Now, I think my personal preference would be option B, just because it's simpler and it seems a little bit more consistent with the original description of the check command, but I could live with option C.
Gavin, do you have any particular preference in this space, or you're just behaving as editor here in this case and looking for the working group to provide guidance?
Well, now that I mean, James has just changed his mind, and now he says he's happy with B as well. My preference would be B as well, just because you could easily end up in a situation where if a client sends half a dozen commands, or half a dozen objects and half a dozen commands, then you end up spending a lot of time permutating through all of the different combinations, and you end up with a fairly slow response, which to something that we should be pretty fast. So I like the idea of just kind of making it sort of fairly tightly constrained. So my preference would be B as well.
Okay. Any other discussion in the Jabber room or here in the room about this? So I believe this is the only issue that's outstanding in this document, correct, Gavin? Right, so he's nodding yes. Okay. So I think
Yeah,
so
a few things have been raised, but I think they've been addressed. So unless anyone else has anything they want to raise, I don't believe there's anything further that needs to be done with this.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to suggest then, as chair, is the action going forward here in the process would be I think let's just choose the option B and suggest that Gavin update the document to have that and submit that to Internet Drafts, and then we will force a discussion on the list and just see if anyone has any final remaining comments, and then we'll push it to last call. I think it's fair to say that this document is ready to go. It certainly has had its fair discussion in the past here, and if we seem to have some consensus among those who have been principals in the past on this document. So I would suggest that we simply pick up and move forward unless anyone wants to object strongly either here or on the list. Any immediate comments on that path forward? So just to be clear, the action then is to you, Gavin, to update the document with option B.
Yep.
And then we'll confirm everything on the mailing list and go to a last call as soon as we can. Okay. Thank you very much, Gavin.
Welcome.
Let's move
Thanks,
on
everyone.
to the next document here. And we have Lin to give a presentation. Let me just bring your document up here.
Okay, hello, my name is Lin Zhou from Cynic.
Can we, bring the
I'll
microphone
put it
down
down.
to point it to? Yeah.
Lin Zhou from Cynic. And the reseller draft, I think it has been discussed in this working group for several times, and I'm going to use the next 10 minutes to give a briefing about the updates of the new version. In section 3.1, some comments said that suggested that we should add a clarification sentence about the reseller identification. Like all reseller objects are identified by a several unique identifier. So this version, we added this text in the new version. Next, please. And this slide is about, we decided to remove the reseller name, the optional element defined in the reseller draft. Because in the version 02, the reseller draft states that a reseller can be referenced optionally by a name. But on mailing list, somebody have comments in the draft, reseller mapping draft, there's XML structure. There is no name at the highest level. So there is only a name element at the post info level. We have two solutions to solve this problem. The first one is we just to remove the reseller name because it's optional. And the second one, we have to adjust the XML schema and put the name at the highest level. So after discussion on the mailing list, we finally decided to remove the name in the reseller draft. Next, please. And access the refactor. And we found that some elements are already defined in RFC 57, 31, and 33. So we just reuse the exact same elements, such as the contact attribute type from domain XSD, post info type from contact SD, and so on. And next, please. About the status issue, I remember that we have talked about it in the last IETF meeting. And also on the mailing list, some people suggest me to reuse the contact status values, and ICDN provided their examples for status values they already implemented. And after collecting all these comments, and it seems that we have not reached a consensus about the status value. So we just keep the original 3 status values in this version. And if anyone has any particular status values, and we can talk about it, and we may consider adding these values to the status. Next, please. This is a clarification about the post info type. The post info type in the reseller mapping draft is almost the same as the contact one, just except missing the organization field. One comment is that we suggest us to reuse the post info type in the domain definition. And after talking with our co-author, and we think that the reseller would not be an individual. So we just simply use the name to represent the organization. So we don't want to make a duplication about the name and organization. So the post info type is a self-defined element in the draft. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, so any questions, comments, discussion? I mean, we do have some discussion apparently to have about the status question. And I see we have a coming to the microphone, relaying the jabber.
Yes, James Gold. Yes, the reseller is an organization, so there is no need for another org field.
Okay, thank you, James. Any comments or questions about the status? Did you have a particular recommendation that you would make, Lin-Lin, about the status?
Yes, someone says reuse the contact status, and someone have their implemented status values. So,
which would you prefer?
Personally, I'm not inclined to reuse the contact status value because I do not think they are the same object with the same status requirements. So I think the OK read-only terminated the 3 values are sufficient.
So I think that absent any discussion, what I would propose as chair that Lin-Lin just update the document to reflect that and push forward. And we'll move the document. But I see over coming to Mike, please go ahead.
Ulrich Wisser from IS. I think the status values for a reseller is, behind the reseller there is some business logic, obviously, and that's kind of why we have that object. And I think it will be very hard to find status values to represent all of the different business models we all have in this room. So I think the 3 values that you pointed out are, yeah, we all have, that's what we all have, but there is a lot of states in between between OK and terminated that I don't think we can get an agreement on from all of us in the room. Besides that, I have one more, and I think that is an objection I have had with this extension from the beginning, is that we don't have registrars. So why is the reseller such an important object we need to have if we decided not to have registrar object? And yeah.
Do you have an answer?
I'm not so clear yet, right now. And because we have registrars and some users complain to us that we cannot check the information of because they are registered from a reseller of one registrar. So they complain to us why we cannot see the reseller name from who is or EPP, and so we do this extension.
Yes, but I mean, then obviously you have a registrar object in your database, and obviously we don't expose that over EPP.
I think it's a good suggestion to do an register.
Now we're exposing the reseller over EPP, and I don't really see, but because then the reseller object would have to be managed by the registrar, which don't manage the registrar object. There seems to be some missing link here. But,
So let's go next in Mike, and then I have a comment.
Relaying for James Gold, asking, the question is, what should happen with the different status values? I would not want to make it too complex for tagging the reseller information.
You said tagging the reseller information? It says tagging. Okay. The only observation that I would add, and I don't know that I have an answer for this at the moment, but I know that in the case of GTLDs and ICANN, there is some energy towards knowing about resellers behind registrars and for that information to be available. And so, you know, losing that here and not having complete information would seem like a bad path. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I just make the observation at the moment. I have to go back and think about that myself and ask our own team what we think about it. But over to the mic.
Yes, James Gold confirming with, yes, the purpose is to tag the objects with reseller information.
Yes. So I think that, you know, and thank you for that, James. I think that there is some energy and effort, you know, at least in ICANN for GTLDs to move forward in that space. So we need to make sure that we have as much information as we can. I think that would be a useful thing to do. So maybe this is an issue we should take to the mailing list and try to force a conclusion. You know, unlike the fee extension, we were just talking about that. This is well, I think the problem that we generally have, or a concern that we generally have in this working group, is there aren't too many people who speak to a lot of these issues. Not too many people are you know, directly vested, so it can be a little hard to identify consensus. But I think it's important to get the question onto the mailing list in that case, so at least we know the few people who have spoken and you know, where we got whatever consensus we got, where it came from. I think for now we'll take the question to the mailing list, and we'll see what we can do about forcing a conclusion and drawing consensus, see what we can get. But this document, like the fee one, I think is pretty close to ready to go. So it just depends on how quickly we can force a consensus here on what to do about the status in particular. So no other comments or questions, I would say thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Going back to the agenda, then a couple things I want to just observe here for the moment and pause before we move forward on the rest of the items on the agenda, just as an administrative matter. So the list of 11 documents that are there in section 2C that are now up on the screen too is the order that the documents had originally appeared in our charter in terms of milestones and work items. I tend to think that we can, I don't think we need to strictly honor and adhere to the order of that list. So, we can move forward according to interest and whatever progress people are making. And I say that in particular because, the fees and the mapping are up there at the top, but they're sort of overtaking the one status mapping document, which seems to just be there at the moment at the top. There isn't any forward progress on that. But I think that's okay. We'll move these two documents forward, and then in principle, we will look at back to the top of the list here and try to pick a document and an author and see who wants to step up and move their document forward as we move these. Another reason why I mention all of this in terms of the order of these things is for the next set of presentations that we have here on the agenda, items 5 through 8, some of these are suitable for work items for this group and some are not. Some are just, information for this group to think about. We'll ask for some clarity on that from each of these presenters as we go on. Excuse me, I apologize. The important thing here is this group it's appropriate for this group to take on discussions of any extension that wants to move on to the standards track, an extension in RDAP or in EPP. And the default thing to do would be to simply add it to the bottom of this list here. But I'm raising a comment about priority of documents in that as long as we have energy and people who are interested in working on something, I don't see an issue with reordering this list of documents. The chairs just have to take on the task of reordering the milestones, and that's just an action that we would go through with the area director. I don't think in principle there's any issue with that. It's just important to track that progress. So what I want to put to the working group here is as we enter these next 4 presentations, let's take note of whether or not it's appropriate for a working group work item or not, so that you can have an opinion about that. And then we'll ask that question at the end of each of these as appropriate. And then we will see if we have any kind of consensus at all about what priority might happen with some of these if they're going to be work items. Okay? So the next one here is the RDAP name server objects, and that's Francisco. Do you want to come up here and talk about that while I get your slides up here? So this is the expiration date document first.
Okay, this is Francisco Arias channeling Gustavo, the author of the documents. So this is this extension is an EPP extension to transmit, so that the registers can transmit to the registries one data field, what is called the registrar registration expiration date. This is coming from the utility space in which this field already exists in the registrars, has been there for a couple years. And now there is a draft policy language in the utility space that is proposing to require from registries that they show this field in their WHOIS output. One important thing to mention is what is in the last bullet here is that this field is not intended to impact in any way the domain life cycle of in the registry site. The way we have seen this working in the utility space is that registrars use this field to identify when they, for example, register a name for longer than what the registrant has paid for, and so in their WHOIS output they show the life for which the registrant has contracted this domain name, while the registry shows what the registrar has contracted to the registry. Another use we have seen is the registrars most of the GTLDs, I understand, use auto-renewal. So when names come for renewal, the expiration date in the registry side changes automatically, but not necessarily does that in the registrar side. That's why you have some difference, and we see that quite often. Next slide, please. So there are three modes of operation that are described in this. Should I take questions?
Sure, why not? Go ahead. At the mic.
James Gold from the Jabber. He has a question on item A, I believe, of the previous slide. Let me see. Which the draft thick whois, I think it means with the draft thick whois consensus policy states to use the RRA whois, which includes a single expiration date field and not two. It's kind of abracadabra to me, but this is what it says.
I'm pretty sure it says it's two fields since I reviewed that document. But that's in the public comment process in the ICANN website. I can provide the link to where that says. But to clarify, it's a draft document, so it's still up for discussion within ICANN. Next slide. So I was saying the draft describes three modes of operation. One in which the first one is in which the registrar doesn't know or doesn't want to handle this EPP extension. So in this case, the registry, well, it's actually a not mode of operation, I guess, since the registrar doesn't know how to do. Should we move to the next slide, please? The second mode of operation is in which the registrar indicates to the registry that these two fields are to be kept in sync. So in this case, the registrar will indicate at login that it supports the EPP extension, but it will never transmit the data field. So in this case, both fields will be kept in sync. Next slide, please. And the final mode of operation is in which the registrar does want to use that field for to keep a different date than the registry. So in this case, the registrar will indicate support for the extension at login and will transmit a register expiration date in either a creation or create, update, or transfer command. And I believe that's, this is an example of how it will look in XML. And finally, to do for the version 1. And with this, I think.
Okay, yeah, that's it then.
That's it, yep.
To the mic, please. Yes.
Relaying for James Gold again. The login services should not be used to define server behavior. It should be used solely to coordinate the extensions supported. And Alexander Meyerhofer agrees with James.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Hi, Scott Hollenbeck. When Gustavo first published this, I came back with a couple of comments. I think the draft is really light on the background, to explain what this is, why it's needed. I mean, he describes the syntax, which is relatively easy. But my biggest concern is the possibility of confusion, right? So as the information is currently described, if I provide a whois or RDAP response where I provide both a registry expiration date and a registrar expiration date, one of two possibilities happen. They agree, right? And then that begs the question of, well, why do I need to publish both? All right, so I do think it's important to add some text to the document that explains the rationale, even if that means referring to, some ICANN documentation someplace that has a reference to the consensus policy, et cetera. All right, and then the other situation is that they're different. All right, so now I'm looking at these and wondering, okay, how can I have two different expiration dates? And so I think that, again, we need to add some text to the document that explains, what that means. And as you and I discussed a little earlier today, I think it might be helpful if we actually used a slightly different tag to describe what this particular expiration date. Maybe call it a registrar service expiration date, registrar contract. I don't know, something to somehow distinguish it between the two so that they don't look quite so similar, And that might just help eliminate some of the confusion, at least in some people's minds.
Thank you, Scott. Just to clarify in the last thing you said about the names of the fields, I think you're referring to the other side, the publication of this in the either WHOIS or RDAP, right? Not the extension percent. Okay, but point taken on the need to add clarification in the draft. I already talked with Gustavo on your comments, and I think he was okay on that.
Ulrich Visser, IS again. I would like to join James and Alexander in the assessment of the login sync behavior definition. I mean, what would that mean if a registrar would log in with sync one time and the next time without sync? Would there be some of his domains would be in synced automatically and some not? That seems like there should be something. If you want it to be defined per domain, then we should say that in your domain creation or domain update or whatever, or we want it to be something that is specific to this registrar, but then it's not the login command the right place to define that. Then that's some business rule in the background that we need to do. So I don't think that the login command is a good place to define this sync behavior.
This is Francisco again. Let me rephrase the what Gustavo put in the slides, the way I understand it, and maybe wrong here, but I think what this is saying is by default, when you are in an environment in which the server it's using this EPP extension and the registrar understand it, by default the dates are in sync unless you specify for a given a domain name that they are not, by providing a date in the by providing a date in the registrar expiration date. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense, but then why not let it send the registrar what they want with the domain creation or domain update anyway? Because
Sorry, again.
First you define the default behavior, and then later you have a way to override it. And so why not let them define the behavior every time they want to have it? That way it's very clear what you want to have, and you don't have to guess. And that would be more EPP, because we usually don't use the login command to define server behavior. And so I think if you look at the other EPP extensions, it's quite clear. If you want the server to do something, send the command. Don't rely on anything.
So when they are not in sync, the way to signal is by setting a date. Otherwise,
yes,
they are in sync. That's why I think it was a simple way to put it. But if you have a specific suggestion on how to improve this mechanism, we'll be happy to hear about it. Thank you.
Relaying for Antoine Verschuren without hats. I agree with Scott. There has been much discussion on this consensus policy within ICANN, asking for the registrar expiry to be removed. If ICANN needs to change their consensus policy to not require a registrar expiry date, what would be the need for this draft?
Correct. If there were no such policy, then there would be no need for that extension at least not in the utility space. But so far, it's still there.
I'm sorry, could you say that again? Not quite sure I understood.
I think what I hear is if there were no such policy in the utility space, there will be no need for this extension.
Okay.
Marco Sanz, I wanted to agree with Ulrich. I don't think this has anything to do with about the syncing, the three options you presented. I don't think it's a good idea to use the login command for that. Login command applies to the session, and I think those are attributes of the objects. So trying to put that in a session doesn't make sense. It will be very difficult afterwards to try to understand what happened with an object if you change the default behaviors in the session.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
So, okay, over to the mic.
Gustavo Lozano himself. I will send the proposal with explicit sync signaling to the mailing list.
Okay. So Gustavo's going to send something. This is Jim talking, and not as chair. I just want to make two comments. I too am concerned about this sync issue. It just doesn't feel right that you can just arbitrarily change the parameters between logins. And I'm not sure that I have a suggested fix for that, but I have to say that bothers me at the moment. So I'm interested in seeing some more discussion from that and other comments from people about it. The second comment I would make, and you've partly answered this in the sense that you said if the consensus policy in ICANN changes so that this field is not required, then you're right, this is all optional and not necessary. But to me, that begs the question of perhaps this work is a bit premature. Shouldn't we wait for stability on the policy side before we start creating technical standards for something that we don't know we're going to need?
Well, this is Francisco, and well, this is I was trying to be proactive on the something that seems like is going to happen. Just like when this whole thing of adopting RDAP, you have two organizations that are needed in order to make things happen, and you have to do something in the ICANN side, you have to do something in the IETF side, and you can either wait one for the other, or you can start working in parallel, and that's what we're thinking on doing here.
Okay, so speaking as chair, then my comment would be, so for the moment, you're just trying to develop the technical specification, and we're having our discussion about that, and that's a good thing. You're not asking for publication at the moment. You'll withhold asking for publication until the policy on the other side catches up and decides that we need this. Would that be fair?
Sure. Are we talking about adoption there, or that's a separate question?
Well, I think, yes, you're right. I said publication, but the first step would be for the working group to adopt the work. So the working group would have to agree to take it on as a work item, and because presumably then this would have to go on to the standards track. You'd want it that way in order to line up with the policy. Would that be correct? I think it's intended for standards track. I don't remember. Well, it's not a working group work item just yet. So.
Yep.
Okay. Back to sort of the logistics and administrative part of this. Yes, ultimately you're going to ask for this. You will at some point in the future ask for this to become a working group work item, but you're not asking this for right now. This is simply a technical specification, and you're taking advantage of the working group to have some discussion about what's in it.
I guess we could live with that. Yep.
Okay. Just want to be clear about the status. Nonetheless, I mean, I do agree. We do have some questions here, and we should take those to the mailing list and see if we can have some more discussion, especially with respect to the login parameters and what they do and don't mean. And I think that's an important technical issue that should be resolved before going forward in any case.
Okay.
But okay. Anything else from anyone? I guess nothing in the Jabber room. No other comments here? All right, then thank you. So let's move to the next one. Give me a moment to get your slides up here. Okay, name server sharing.
So again, Francisco, Shanley, and Gustavo. This is an RDAP extension. Consider this scenario is a registry that has two external hosts. This is the registry for the TLD example, and has two host objects ending in so example.com. They are clearly external hosts, but each of them are from different registrars. However, they share the same name. This apparently is not a very common but still existing configuration in some registries, and there is an issue in RDAP in order to be able to discover the information for these two different hosts. There is no immediate mechanism to do so. So what the proposal is, next slide please. This is what I already said. Next slide. Will be to an extension that will add, in this case, a relation collection and a link that will give you the full set of results. So all the objects that have the same hostname. We can go to the next slide. This is an example of how the output of this output will look like. This is the standard name server name search that is already specified in the RFC 7482. Just instead of doing a search with a partial name, it will be with the full name, and it will give you all the different hosts that have the same name. Next slide, please. And the extension is also adding a mechanism to do a name server lookup based on the handle, the raw ID of the host object. So in case someone wants to get the data of one specific object, they can do so. And the details are there. And I believe that's it for the presentation. Yes.
Comments or questions?
Andy Newton, Aaron. So I read this draft. I think it's good. My only real comment is about the path extension for the queries. It's handle underbar name server. For some reason, to me, it seems like name server underbar the two words should be reversed. That's a small thing. Just reads kind of funny to me. The people at NixCZ did something very cool. They registered their RDAP extension. So if any of them are here, I'll buy you a beer at the VeriSign Shindig. Very good of me, huh? But what they did was they did the same thing. They have a name server, shared name server data structure. They also put DNS key data in there, shared DNS key data in there as well. So it may benefit us to look at what they did and try to incorporate that as well.
Good, thank you. I didn't know they were doing that. Probably Gustavo didn't know either.
Okay, any other comments? Nobody at the mic, nothing in Jabber? Okay, so would you be asking for this to be adopted by the working group?
Oh, yes.
Okay, and it looks like this is also fairly complete, so we're going to be moving this along quickly, but now we have a line to the mic.
It's a long comment by Antoine, so I guess he was busy typing. No heads. I had a little conversation with Gustavo about this already. I see host objects for external host, not under the TLDs it's serving, as database pollution with no additional benefit, but adding to complexity. Especially in the external host, if the external host is only created once and the registrar that created it becomes the sponsoring register by default. It simply leads to unjust situations due to wrong assumption of ownership. I would say a better solution for this problem would be for registries to delete all external host objects from their database and not allow for the creation of new ones. I do realize that being a better solution would also mean more work for registries that now support random host object creation initially. And it would be quite a long fight to convince them. Even in the end, it would mean a simpler process for them as well. I would appreciate some text in the draft that explains this host concept and that name servers sharing can only happen with external hosts. This to prevent creators of new databases to think twice about using external host objects. I would like to know what others think of this.
Any comments from you, Francisco, first?
Well, I was part of those private emails, and I think Gustavo is positive, but I don't want to talk for him, but I believe he's positive to that idea. I think he said yes. So yeah, should not be a problem to add more explanatory text.
So Andy, I really don't have any skin in this game, but it seems to me that that's advisory text you want to give to a registry, and whether they want to do it or not, it's up to them. So I don't think it should be a must not do that or must clean up or whatever.
Correct.
It's good advice, but I don't think.
Right. The way I understood it, it was more of adding an explanation on in which scenario this would be usable and potentially another options to use, but not part of the definition of what's going on here with the extension. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, no other discussion? So same as before, I guess you're looking for this document to be adopted by the working group?
Yes.
And it also sounds like there is an update, but it sounds like you're amenable, or Gustavo is amenable for the update in the new document. And this thing would be eligible to move forward rather quickly, since there doesn't seem to be any disagreement, and so it's mostly done. So let me suggest first that the action is to provide a revised document to the mailing list, and as long as there's no negative reaction to that, it can move to last call fairly quickly. And separately, the chairs will take as an action once this is, we'll formally adopt it on the working group mailing list. We'll also ask on the list to make sure there's no objections to adopting it. And then we'll also seek to update our milestones to reflect that it's there, and so it can be properly tracked by the whole system here and move forward quickly. And any other comments or reactions from the group or in Jabber? I'm not seeing anything. So I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next up is federated authentication by Scott. You want to come up while I take a moment to get your slides here for you? And there we go.
Thank you. All right, so let's get this out of the way first. I am not proposing that this document, that there is an internet draft referenced here, that it is ready for consideration for adoption. All right, I think I've got something that's actually backed up with running code, but it's still partially baked, and I'm not yet comfortable suggesting that it's ready for working group adoption. So having said that, next slide, please. So indeed, so VeriSign Labs has taken on an experiment here to see if RDAP can be augmented with federated authentication. If you're wondering, what does federated authentication mean? Are you familiar with how single sign-on works? You try to log into Gmail with your Facebook credentials or something like that, or vice versa. Think of it in much the same way. The idea here is that you have a credential issued by someone, some entity, and you can use that credential to access other services. And so why is that interesting? Core RDAP, if you look at RFC 7481, so first off, how many of you are running an operational or experimental RDAP service today? All right, I see a number of hands that have gone up. How many of you support either basic or digest authentication with that service? No hands. Every single one of you is running a non-compliant RDAP service. Take a look at RFC 7481. There are musts in there about what you must support because you're running an HTTP service. Okay? Now, having said that, we don't support it either in our experiment. All right? And that's because I think reality is this does not scale on a number of fronts. If you're going to be running an RDAP service for a large TLD or anything, an address registry that receives millions of queries per day, I don't think you want to be in the business of issuing username and password credentials to every possible user. All right, so that was the motivation behind this particular exploration. All right, so anyway, keep that whole compliance thing in mind at some point, because as I said, in RFC 7481, it's a must. So we wanted to see if it's possible to do something that would allow us to extend the core specifications. And the best way to do that, I thought, was with running code. It's real easy to sit down and just put pen to paper and make something up in an internet draft. It's something else completely to see if it actually works and can be implemented in software. So running code, very important. I also wanted to see if there was anything in the core RDAP RFCs themselves related to interoperability and whether or not that there'd be any gotchas when VeriSign was given the word that we had to actually do this in production space. If you want to talk to Francisco about how ICANN intends to approach this, we have contractual obligations to implement RDAP. When a point that ICANN says, VeriSign and all of you other TLD operators, go. Well, I didn't want to be tripping over specification issues when the clock is ticking. So, do a little bit of experimentation first off the clock and use that experience to guide the process later on. And that last bullet is really, really, really important. There are a number of policy development activities that are still happening within ICANN today. Transition to thick whois for the thin registries, support for internationalization. And then, a very new PDP just started up that was looking at this transition from whois to RDAP and whether or not we need to have an RDDS service at all. That's actually part of their charter. So, and again, I don't want the policymakers making decisions without some guidance on what can be implemented in software, what can't, and how the best ways to approach some of these topics might be. So let's have some running code to explore some of these topics. Next slide, please. Okay, so for the foundations for our experiment, those of you who know VeriSign know that we operate COM, NET, and a couple of other, very large TLDs. But because those TLDs are subject to contractual obligations with ICANN, I didn't want to go there in terms of experimenting, particularly if part of what I was going to be doing was restricting access to information, and our contracts say that you must provide all information all the time to anyone who asks. My attorneys told me it's wise to just not go there, don't ask questions, and to work in a space where we have a little bit more freedom to experiment. So that meant CCTLDs. And in the case of VeriSign, is CCTLD operator.tv and .cc. Now, unfortunately, these are both thin registries. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the thin versus thick concept, if you query a TLD registry and that registry maintains contact information on registrants, tech contacts and billing contacts, we consider that to be a thick registry. A thin registry is one in which that information is maintained by the registrar, and the only thing that the registry has is information that associates the domain to the registrar and some metadata that's needed, or data that's needed to publish the domain in the TLD zone, and the metadata created as a result of the registration process. So things like the registry expiration date, not the registrar expiration date, current status information, things like that. All right, and so why is this interesting from an experimental perspective? Unfortunately, I don't have access to anything with these two TLDs that would be considered PII, at least not in the absolute sense. I don't have the names of people, I don't have their addresses, I don't have their email addresses, I don't have their telephone numbers. All right? So when I talk a little later about, where are you thick registries, this is where I'm coming from. It'd be really nice to have some other people participating in the experiment who are operating registries where you have access to this information. Okay? So I know we talk about federated authentication. Again, if you look at RFC 7481, it describes a number of methods of obtaining this federation concept. So what I want to do is look at something that's already out there. It exists in terms of available software libraries and would make the task of conducting this experiment relatively easy. I had no clue as to the best way to go. So I thought, let me talk to some people who have clue. Sent a note off to the HTTP auth working group. I got nothing. Sent a request off to the OAuth working group. I got nothing. Finally poked my head into an OAuth working group meeting, stood up at the mic and kind of said, hey guys, look, I'm asking you questions here. Could someone please help me out? And one very helpful, clueful person came to me afterwards and said, take a look at OpenID Connect. So I did. And it turns out that it's actually pretty well molded in terms of available software and the technologies it provides for the kinds of use cases that work for RDAP. So we built the experiment on a relying party or a server-side implementation of OpenID Connect, that can be attached to our RDAP server, right? And we also implemented an identity provider. Not that VeriSign intends to get into the identity provider business, but part of the internet draft that I described includes some things that identity providers need to do. So when you start talking about authorization, for example, what can a client do? The server doesn't necessarily have this information, cached or stored locally because we really don't know who the clients are. We don't want to be in the business of issuing credentials. We want the identity providers to do that. And so what's an example of an identity provider? I see Bobby Flame sitting over there. Okay. I think it's fairly well understood who Bobby's employer is. Does anybody not know? Are you okay with? Okay, so let's just use anybody as an example. I'm a VeriSign employee, right? If I'm trying to talk to the Affiliates RDAP server, who knows something about who I am and what kind of rights and responsibilities and privileges that they're giving to me? Affiliates doesn't know anything about me as a VeriSign employee. VeriSign does. So it makes sense for if I'm using a VeriSign credential, for VeriSign to make some claims about who I am, what's my role in the company, and what kinds of things can I do given that role in the company. All right. And given that I wanted to make some changes to the way these identity providers work and the way OpenID works, it just made sense for us to implement the provider software ourselves, and we can experiment there. Now, of course, having said that, it's also very helpful to get other people implementing identity providers on board so that we can work out interoperability concerns. Okay? Yep. And then lastly, I wanted to document this in an internet draft because I do think that eventually this could be a foundation for something that's of interest to this working group and of interest to the industry as a whole. As I said, if we're going to be going to a way of operating in which it may be possible to provide differentiated access, as in, the information you get back from an RDAP service will depend on who you are, why you're asking, where you're asking from, when you're asking, how you're asking. I mean, any number of combination of these particular questions. The server can't make those types of access control and authorization decisions unless they know something about who the client is. And that has to be more than a source IP address, right? So, as I said, I've got an internet draft out there. It's an individual submission for now. It will probably stay that way for a while. But if you're interested in looking at it and you're interested in playing and maybe joining the experiment, this is a good place to start. Next slide. So where are we in terms of execution of the experiment itself? While we've been writing software for a while, we announced it publicly on February 3rd. And public announcement in this case meant, sending a notice to Regext, RegOps, and GTLD Tech, any number of mailing lists on which I thought interested people might be lurking. Right now, we have a terms of service attached to it in which we're proposing an end to the experiment of 6 June. I believe we're going to be extending that probably more than once, but this was something that my attorneys required me to throw in there so that there is no expectation that this will be around forever, all right? And that, on 4 June, if we do decide to shut it down, someone can't come back and yell at me and complain and sue VeriSign because they built a business on top of this or something. So, as I said, right now, if you look at the terms of service, it says 3 June, please, I fully intend to extend this for as long as it makes sense to continue conducting the experiment. We haven't found any issues yet with implementing core RDAP. And I think that's a good thing. Even though these are proposed standards and there's an expectation that there, may still be some issues there, we haven't really found anything significant. We ran our software through 2 different test suites, the one by APNIC and the one by Viagini. Found a couple of issues in our code. Those were very easily fixed. But so far, things with RDAP itself have been quite good. We used the findings, to actually to update the internet draft. Those of you who, if anyone, I'm sorry, I don't want to presume that any of you have been following what I've been writing, but if you have, the first versions were somewhat hand-wavy in a couple of areas, particularly with respect to path segments and the actual syntax for executing commands. And so as we've been experimenting, we have been actively updating the draft to reflect, the findings of the experiment. Okay. Right now, the service that we are running, and for those of you who care to look, you can find a web interface to this service at rdap.verisignlabs.com. Should be up and running right now, and if it's not, I have to go smack my development team. But feel free to take a look at it right now if you want. Supports both unauthenticated access to TV and CC data and authenticated access. All right? Unauthenticated access, though, will get you very little information right now. What we designed in is that you will get back basically no more than what you would get with a DNS query for a particular domain name. The DNS information is publicly available, can be found with a query, to your favorite name server, and we thought, okay, fine. This makes a reasonable attempt at what unauthenticated access might look like. But what about authenticated access? There are some publicly available identity providers that many people already have access to, and perhaps you don't even know it. If you have a Gmail email address or a Hotmail email address, you have an OpenID credential. All right, both of those services actually include support for OpenID. And so we thought, okay, so those are 2 very low bar, low barrier to entry credentials that we can support in our experiment. And if you attempt to use the service and you use one of those 2 types of credentials, you will get access to a little bit more information than what you would get if you perform an unauthenticated query. right? So for example, we would give you back some of the metadata associated with the registration, the expiration date, domain status, things like that. But again, no PII. The idea being that a credential like this, for which there is virtually no barrier to entry, there hasn't been any due diligence done on, on what you really need access to the information for. So again, just as an example, we thought this was one way we could demonstrate that particular capability. Okay, but we did add support for two other identity providers. One is the one that Nick.cz has developed. And so if you have a credential issued by Yarmer's IDP, you actually get back quite a bit more information. And the other IDP that we added support for was the one developed by VeriSign Labs. I kind of have to support that one because that allows us to do a better experiment, right? But we are limiting access to the people we issue those credentials to because again, I don't want to get into the business of having to field requests from, I don't know, even 100 people to say, hey, give me a VeriSign Labs credential. It just becomes unmanageable. Okay, next slide, please. So what have we found? Amazingly, not only the core RDAP specifications have proven to be, quite implementable and interoperable, the OpenID Connect specs too have proven to be quite interoperable. I think the biggest issue we've had is that some of the libraries are just functionally incomplete. They just don't support everything. And so when you talk about, for example, refresh tokens, that's a bullet point I've got here a little bit later. Not all of the providers implement support for these features, all right? We found it very easy to actually integrate the IDPs and the RPs, assuming that they provide the appropriate level of functionality. No issues there whatsoever, with the except for one issue we found related to an authorization time claim. The OpenID spec says that this is a number of seconds since something. Right? So how many of you are who actually write code? There's a few of you. And if someone gave you a requirement to represent a variable as a number, what data type would you use? I hope you're telling me I don't have enough information to answer that question, right? Because in some cases it makes sense to use an integer. In some cases it makes sense to use a floating point or a real number. Unfortunately, this is a situation in which one software implementer made one choice, another chose the other type, and we've actually run into an interoperability situation where they don't work well together. And here's the other fun thing. If you're working with open source software, you have very little leverage over the committers and the maintainers. So the packages that on both ends of this particular exchange are actually being coordinated using Git and GitHub. They have an issue queue. We have issues opened up in both queues, right? So Yarmer opened up one and with his provider, we opened up one with Google. And you know how much interest or responsive or feedback we've gotten to those issues? None. Zero. So what do? You can continue to poke people all you want, but eventually if you want to make progress, you take matters into your own hands. And so that's what we did. We took the Google source, modified it to do what we need to do so that it works with Yarmer's implementation, and we're off and running. Now, we still need to continue this in the background because this, in my mind, is an ambiguity in the OpenID spec. And if two parties already found a way to not interoperate, it's bound to happen again. It's also very easy to add new claims. And so my internet draft right now has a claim in there, a JSON web token for a claim that's described as a stated purpose. So if you're submitting a request to an RDAP server, you must be asking for a reason. And while I think in many cases the reason is, I am scraping for email addresses for my spam campaign, and unfortunately no one is going to use that and actually state that that's the reason. But in theory going forward, there were people who have legitimate purposes, and we will come up with some list of what those purposes are and what type of authorization you get based on those purposes. All right. But in terms of creating new claims, there's an IANA registry for this information. I've got a registration request, in the draft that says, please register this particular purpose. And in theory, this is all it really takes. The document moves forward, IANA, puts it in the registry, software implementers add it, and you're off and running. There will undoubtedly be many, many more, or well, at least a few more types of claims to describe other facets of information that the server operators will need to determine levels of authorization, levels of access. And that gets to this last bullet. There's going to be a very long process here to determine exactly what kinds of things need to happen in terms of policy for authorization and access control. As I mentioned, there is a brand new policy development working group that kicked off in ICANN very recently. Their work will likely take, a unit of time measured in years before they produce an output. And I fully suspect that, what I'd like to do is keep this experiment running in parallel. So as this group decides, well, these are the kinds of attributes we'd like to associate with clients, I have an ability to, create claims for this and test them out using the running code. All right, Barry, something I'd like to ask you for help with. Remember what I said about reaching out to HTTP auth and OAuth and being greeted with crickets? I've got a similar situation happening here right now. So I had sent a note off to OAuth just saying, hey, look, I'd really like to get a little bit of cross-area review help here. I want to make sure that what I'm doing just passes the sniff test in terms of sanity. And while I did have one person eventually, giving multiple pokes say that, yes, I think I'll try to get to that eventually, that still hasn't happened. And look, this is still an individual submission. We're clearly not very far into the process. And maybe this is Alexi's problem. But at some point, it'd be nice to get some people who have some clue with respect to OpenID and OAuth to look at this and let me know where I'm sniffing glue or not.
It certainly carries more weight when it comes from a working group than when it comes from Scott, even Scott, the former AD, because that was a long time ago and nobody remembers.
Nope.
So you'll forget me in a few years as well. But anyway, I'm covering OAuth for Kathleen while she's out on maternity leave. So I will, in the OAuth meeting later this week, I'll remind them that they have this request.
Right. And then the last thing that we found in talking, to Andy Newton at Aaron, and Andy, I'll let you talk to anything you want to talk about there. He had raised the question of, do we need to support refresh tokens? A refresh token is a mechanism that these cooperating parties can use to continue an authorization session without having to go back and re-authenticate. Because the way the authentication process works here right now, and this is again, one of the little glitches, the things that I don't like about the way OpenID Connect works, it has a browser dependency. If you use my web interface and you give it a credential, you're going to get redirected to the web login interface provided by either Hotmail or Google or VeriSign or Nick.cz. This works great if you happen to be using a web browser for your RDAP client. It doesn't work so great if you're using something like wget, curl, or anything that isn't a browser. All right? So we're not quite there yet, and this is, again, one of the things that's preventing me from saying this document is ready for prime time or working group adoption. Next, please. So where do we want to go with this from here? In addition to just keeping this experiment running for as long as the policy development work is happening, I'd really like to see a little bit more help, guidance, feedback from those of you who are going to be running RDAP services, particularly if you have access to contact information. Because I think it'll be very helpful to be able to demonstrate what we can and cannot do with PII, particularly as the policy development work evolves over time. Right? If you're not aware of it, if you care about this ICANN PDP is ongoing. They have both active participant and observer states. It's not too hard to find. Just a little bit of searching with your favorite search engine, or talk to me, talk to Francisco. We will gladly point you in the right direction. Technical clue will be very helpful. As you might imagine, there are a lot of people who've got policy backgrounds, business backgrounds. But when I looked at the survey of people who understand protocol development or security or any of the other kinds of things that we care about, numbered in the single digits, like as in count on one hand types of numbers. More help there would be very helpful. I do intend to continue to report our findings as things evolve. All right, so eventually, every once in a while, you're going to see me posting something to the mailing list. Please don't get annoyed with me. I'm just trying to keep you informed with where this is going, and as I said, continuing to solicit feedback and input. Right? And as I've already said more than once, I do believe that we're going to have enough to keep us going past 3 June, but for now, if you wake up on 4 June and try this and it's not there, you were warned. All right? And that's my last slide, I believe. Any questions, thoughts, concerns, comments?
Andy and Aaron, so long as you're buying a spear, I don't care what you send to the mailing list. So, I'm just kidding. So,
All right. So
Okay,
now we
so
know.
for those who are remote, we should explain what the joke is and why we're all laughing. So Scott had volunteered to have a beer off tonight, and he was hosting it in particular to talk
Yes.
about RDAP issues. So
Yeah, from 9 to midnight in the, what do they call it? The executive lounge on the 8th floor. If you're interested, you want to come talk about this stuff or anything, EPP, RDAP, whatever, beer's on me.
so anyway, Sandy again. What I was going to say is that we're looking into this. In fact, we have developers working on OAuth and OpenID authorization servers right now. And we're going to probably put this in our RDAP implementation. So we're very interested in it, and I think the working group ought to continue to work on this. Other than the refresh token issue, which I think is not just a non-browser issue, it probably also affects browsers as well. The other issue is for non-browser clients, I believe there's going to be an issue about understanding which identity provider you need to use. As we started walking through it now, when I get around to trying to put this into my non-browser client, well, I'll probably discover this, but one of the solutions may be to augment the Bootstrap, RDAP Bootstrap, or maybe put some sort of query into the extra query into the RDAP servers for identifying identity providers.
Yep. Yeah, as it turns out, there is a discovery protocol in OpenID Connect. Whether or not that works for us is still an open question as well. Is that it?
So I'll just make one comment and just build on what Scott was saying about joining the ICANN PDP. I know that probably sounds a little bit scary to some people, especially in the IETF, but it is worth noting that the policy development processes in ICANN are open to individuals. Anyone can actually submit to join. And to clearly delineate what it means to be a contributor versus an observer. You can be an observer, and what that does is it gives you access to receiving the mailing list messages. And you should also be able to get access to the community wiki so that anything that happens to be part of the working group that might be restricted, you can always get. But most of the stuff is public anyway, so you don't really need that login credential in order to get access to the wiki. You can get all the documents. If you actually want to contribute, then there's a form to fill out, and you submit it, and you say who you are and why, and then you get acknowledged and added, and then you're added to the mailing list, and you can actually send messages to it. We all understand how mailman authorization works, and that's all that's going on here. But please keep that in mind. You don't hear a lot about these opportunities, but this is one which would be quite valuable for people who have technical experience. I mean, if nothing else, be an observer and feel free to point any comments or concerns that you have to those of us who do actually actively participate. And Scott and I are two people here in this room who do both participate in this particular PDP. So anyway, if there's nothing else, nothing in the jabber, so we're getting a no.
Thank you very much.
Right. Thanks, Scott. Okay. And that brings us to Oliver. Let me get your slides up here. And these should be the new deck. For those who might have downloaded slides, we updated these slides earlier today, or not too long ago here. So if you downloaded them, you might want to go grab another version if you downloaded them earlier. Over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I'm here to talk about something that is not EPP. The word RDAP occurs once in this slide deck, but this is about part of the registration system. This is a collaboration of a number of us who come from different parts of the ecosystems. I am with a DNS operator, third-party DNS operator. Jacques Latour is with the CCTLD registry. Paul is with an operating system vendor and an end user, and Matt is with a large registry/registrar operation. So we come from this from various angles, but there is an issue that needs to be somehow dealt with. Next slide. Some of you may have seen this picture before. This is supposed to be the world view of registrations. Unfortunately, I ask you, find the DNS operator in this picture. It's Scott said it's standing to the left, probably implying Jim over there. Okay. It can be anybody who is in this picture except for ICANN. Could be the registry, could be the registrar, could be the registrant reseller, or it could be somebody outside the picture. If it happens to be the registrar, reseller, or the registry, they are what I call a first-class DNS operator, i.e. one that can do any changes into the DNS and the registration system without ever talking to the registrant. Registrant is a second-class DNS operator because they have to go through some authenticated interface to put information in. And then there are, of course, people like me, or operators like me, who are third class, and we somehow have to get necessary information into the system via somebody else. Next slide. So what are the requirements? I'm started this from the point of view we need to make it easier to propagate DS records from the DNS operator into the DNS. As a third-party DNS operator, it is very hard. Third-party operator can get the attention of the registrant twice. When the registrant shows up and when the registrant leaves. Okay, that's it. So if I'm operating DNSSEC on somebody's behalf or somebody else's, and a key rollover has to happen, guess it's not. It's impossible to do because getting all the registrant's attention is not going to happen. Sorry. So we want to be able to publish the DSs, maintain them totally without involving the registrant. We want to avoid any problems with domain hijackings and all that. We also would like to be able to just upload the DSs for the registrant and just have security going forward and maintaining it. And in this, we also wanted to be able to have all the necessary operations supported. It is not just maintaining the DSs, but also adding new one, introducing a new one, and more importantly, getting rid of them. So I think we all can agree these are very good requirements and everybody should follow them, right? No, nobody in the room objects. Next. So in the DNSOP working group, there was a proposed RFC published a few years ago that defines the CDS and the CDNS key records. Those are for the children to publish what they want reflected in the DS. The document, due to politics, only supports maintaining the DSs. So Paul and I have another document that just started an IETF working group last call today, sorry, just before midnight last night, on how to add the introduction and the deletion operations. And on top of that, we have this document that we're talking about here, which is based on building on that to put it into the system. We want to be able to find a URI for somebody who can inject information into the registration systems. We strictly do not care who we are talking to. We just want somebody who can act and do the right thing. Well, all we want to do is say, hey, please check this, see if the CDNS record or CDNS key record is being published, and act on it. Doesn't have to happen instantly, just happen at some point with some predictability. And the entity we talk to is what we call a parental agent. It could be the registrar, it could be a reseller, it could be a registry, it could be an outsourced third party, it could be your corporate apartment, it could be the address registries. Just if it is somebody who can modify the parent. That's all we want to be able to inflict on. Okay, next slide. Simple RESTful protocol. There is 4 or 5 operations defined in the draft. They all follow this same simple thing. You make a call, you give and on the syntax line, you put the right REST command, and then it says what domain you are talking to and what the operation is. There are a few error codes defined in there. We may want to add more. We may want to delete some, and we need a feedback on that. Take a look at the document. Next. Okay, there are a few open issues. We're looking for a forum to talk about them. We figured that this was close to being one, as it now is talking about registration systems in general. Hopefully it is not just limited to EPP and RDAP, but RDAP is going to come in here. Because the hardest problem is not defining this protocol. The hardest problem is discovering who to talk to. It would be very easy if we could just look up in RDAP what is a URI to talk to for a given domain. Okay, that's all we want to know. So, because when you think about it, for every case we have a third-party DNS operator, it is unknown to the registrar or the reseller or whoever in the parent. In some cases, the DNS operator can even be unknown to the registrant, because the registrant has outsourced this domain name to somebody, say like a digital agency, who has then hired a hosting provider and a DNS operator. Okay, or this domain was registered by a law firm who is doing whatever IP claims. So finding the parent or finding the chain to talk to the parent via the normal channel or alleged channel that is supposed to exist today is hard. Hopefully we can find an automated way to do it. If anybody here is going to stop up and say this is a violation of contract, we are really trying to avoid violating any contract, and hopefully the party who's operating the DNS is somehow contracted to the registrant. Maybe not directly, maybe indirectly. So there should be no violations there. And the authentication model, great conversation. Unfortunately, there are going to be more than one. In some cases, just to pull a rabbit out of a hat, I'm a relatively large, represent a relatively large DNS operator, so Marco at DNIC may say, okay, yeah, we trust you. If you send us messages, we will act on them. Are they going to know John here, who is a small one? No. So acceptance policies for these two operators might be different. Do I know every TLD in the world? No. Do I have a domain in all of them? Yes. Okay, so let's take the authentication issue on separately, because there may be different models to create there. If we agree on going this forward, I would really love, on the behalf of the authors, to ask that this document be adopted and discussed and expedited. Never said I was pushy. Thank you.
Any comments from anyone, Jab or otherwise? Anyone want to get to the mic? I'm holding my tongue for the moment.
Yeah, John Levine. The bad news is this is a disgusting kludge. But the good news is that compared to the alternatives, it's great. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm the canonical tiny outsourced domain operator, and I gave a little talk on Sunday explaining that I have 300 domains, half of which I can do DSs because I am the reseller, and the other half, forget it, for reasons that Oliver described. So having thought about it for a while, I don't see anything that is less awful than this. And I hope we do not bike shed too badly about how this destroys the DNSSEC trust model because there's no HSMs involved.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, there's some warts to work out, but I hope we do it.
Thank you.
Dan York, I would just say for those in this room who are not
living in the world of DNS and DNSSEC, this is a big piece that many of us see as needed to help make the deployment work better, because we're seeing this be a problem. As I watch Jim shake over there a bit as he does that, but I would say that for many of us, we see this as people. There are many of us who see this as a way to help get around this challenge that we have in large-scale deployment.
So, Jim Galvin, I'll insert myself in the queue here. No hats on, and make two comments. First, given your definition of first-class citizen, I object to being called a first-class citizen. But I think you know that. It's all about administrative domains. I mean, the fact that a registry is technically capable of doing things does not mean that the registry can do something. They just, don't have the authority to do it. So, but that's a different problem. Separately, from a technical point of view, I actually do like this. I like this sort of solution. I think it's interesting. As John said earlier, I'm working through some issues in my mind here, and there are some, well, he called them warts. I like that word. So there's some things that we need to talk about and look through. But I will observe that it gets you past, I think it gets you past the administrative domain problem that one has in managing zones, but now it butts you right up against the business model problem, okay, which is how are you going to get registrars to actually do this? And the real issue here is they already provide DNS services for free, and you're suggesting that they should now, for free, provide something for someone else to make money, and a service for someone else who wants to make money doing something that they would otherwise provide for free. And I just, that's an interesting part of this in my mind. Probably deserves more discussion. So let me come back to being chair and let you respond, and then back into the queue.
Just to follow up on your last comment, Jim, I would not classify registrars as being totally against this. The ones I have talked to, once they realize the potential of either creating better relationships with the DNS operators or save money or save development on user interfaces, they are not objecting to this. What they object to is not having the ability to stop registries or somebody else injecting data into what they call theirs.
Yeah, I mean, John Levine again. Registrars provide auth codes for transfers away. And this is much less, if I were a registrar, I would find this considerably less painful than that.
And I'm sorry, Andy, just real quick, as chair, I do have to point out that we are sort of running out of time here. And we actually have to end more or less on time because of Meet Echo. It's the only fair way to do this. So,
Okay,
but,
I'll make
we have
this
one more
quick.
Presentation. So, Andy.
Yeah, Andy Newton, I think I like this. I think this ought to find a home somewhere in the IETF, if not here. We recently got a comment about people wanting to do bulk updates. So I noticed this protocol doesn't really support it, but unless it's kind of one, you're doing it one domain at a time.
Yeah.
But we can talk offline. I do have some other concerns about this, but overall, I think it's a good thing to do.
Thank you.
Nothing in the Jabber room. So, okay, we'll move on. Thank you, Oliver. So we'll just continue this discussion on the mailing list. You're not asking for the moment for adoption, or are you? You want it to be adopted by the working group. Okay, we'll take that question to the mailing list as the action. Thank you. Okay, we have one more presentation here. And I know there's one more here. And, oh, it's Wei. And Lin, you're going to make the presentation? Okay. And let me bring up your slides. Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Wang Wei was supposed to be here, but he has some other things. And then so I, talk
Can you
about-
step closer to the mic, please? Or,
Yes.
Yeah, point it down at you. I know Oliver's very tall.
Yes. Okay. Mr. Wang Wei, I apologize that Mr. Wang Wei could not make it possible to be here, and I will talk about contact and domain name verification drafts instead of him. And actually, it seems that the verification issue becomes a topic and got community community concerns recently in IETF, ICANN, and some other meetings. And actually, it is a policy requirement, I think, especially in China. And if you want to register a domain name in China, and there are typically two verification processes. And the first one is the domain name verification process. And you submit your domain name to the registry, and the registry would check whether this domain is valid, legal, or whether it is reserved for some other organizations or companies. And the second verification process is the contact or real name verification process. And you should provide some proof materials to the registry and to prove that you are the real one. And some materials like ID number or organization license. And there are also two drafts, verification code draft and the NV draft in our working group. And that they give us a description about the VSP business model that the verification service provider will supply the verification service to as a third party to the registries that who want to sell domain names in China. Next, please. And as Cynic and ZDNS in China, we have done the verification practice for many years, since 2009. And we found some key factors that are very important. And so we list the 4 factors here. And the first one is time sensitivity. The verification service impacts the SLA of registrar and registries. And the second one is transparency. The users always want to know the verification process and the verification timeline or process. And the third one is as the verification process is kind of complicated. So there are multiple interactions and state changes during this process. And the last one is the integrity of historical records. Next, please. So in the contact and domain verification draft, we defined 4 status for verification process. And this is the status changing diagram that shows the process under any given verification framework. And so when written a draft, extension draft of EPP to indicate the status process transfer. Next, please. In this draft, we have defined a distinction type, and I remember that on the mailing list, Patrick said that the distinction is not a good name to be understood, so we may call it distinction or restriction type or something like this. And we also have 4 verification status: unverified, pending, verified, passed, and failed, and some date, time information, and client identifier. So the check and the info command and response are extended to support the information, extension information. Next, please. This is the last slide. It's about the next step, and we want to. We know that we want to do some tests and cooperation with global TLD registration and local VSPs. And in this process, we may find that maybe more status values might be needed to describe a universal process to different VSP practices. So the EPP commands or the drafts might be extended further to in line with the varied VSP practice. That's it.
Okay, questions or comments? Maybe you can speak to the question of you're looking for this to be adopted?
Not to this time.
Not at this time. Okay, that's good to know. Questions, discussion, comments? Anything in the jabber? No? Okay. I don't have any questions or comments at the moment either, although I do recognize the significance of this work from a registry point of view. Anybody who's a registry does care a great deal about this verification process in China and these extensions being needed for that from a business point of view. But we'll see. I don't have any issue with keeping a discussion on the mailing list, so keeping the document there and you know, submitting it and seeing if we can get any discussion going. And I assume there's no objections. It's certainly a relevant topic area. So,
Okay,
and I guess that would be it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our agenda. We're in the last section here of any other business. Does anybody have anything else that they want to talk about, mention, suggest, concerns, questions, about anything at all? I don't see anything in the jabber. No one in the room is getting up and rushing to the mic, even though we have a relatively full room here, which is interesting for this working group, I have to say. I think this is the largest number of attendees we've had for this working group since it started. So I think that that's great. We gave it a new name, that's right. So there's yeah, it's all, what's in a name? Oh, we let Oliver in, or other comments from the floor here. I hope this does mean that there's new energy in this group and new interest in moving forward and progressing work. I know that a lot of this stuff, the EPP stuff and extensions and RDEP stuff, I mean, it tended towards the end there and even up to this point today to have limited participation, but that's in part because there just seems to be a limited number of people who are, really committed to this. So I'm really excited and happy that we have so many people in the room, and I hope it continues. Please do come back next time and participate on the mailing list. I think with that, that's it. Let me just look here at my back channel that I have going on with my co-chair and make sure he hasn't written anything in here to me that he needs said before we're done. But if not, I don't see anything. Okay, last question, blue sheets. They're around somewhere. Can somebody hold up the blue sheets or make sure they come to the front of the room? If you need to sign in and haven't, you can follow them to the front of the room, please, and sign in. And otherwise, I would say we're adjourned. So thank you to MediaCo. We're done.
I don't mind it, but I should do. Oh, it's fine.
Oh, I did overlook the idea that we definitely should thank Marco as our Jabber scribe and Ulrich here as our note scribe. My apologies for those are important functions and really appreciate those guys taking that on.
Please go.
Oh, you bring it.